I love how Zoom just like announces it, like just blasts it. I mean, that's good. Like consent is important, right? But it always, I don't know, always cracks me up. Good morning, y'all. How are we holding up today? At what is it? 10 o'clock? Good Lord, it feels like it's 8. And everyone I've spoken to this week it seems like this week has just been very, very long, right? That just seems to be the vibe where one day feels like 4 days in one. But I really appreciate y'all taking the time out of your mornings, even if you're just curled up in a blanket, drinking a cup of coffee or tea, which I truly hope you are doing. Really appreciate your time. So my name is DeHaven. I use they, them pronouns. We'll get to that in a moment. I'm going to make a massive disclaimer right out of the gate that I am not a mental health practitioner, provider, anything like that. My background is education. I've worked at various organizations doing LGBTQ work across Virginia, and now I'm working at a larger national nonprofit, creating curriculum for all youth, but again, like really centering Black, Brown, LGBTQ youth. So my background is education. I've done different support groups at organizations like Side by Side, provided like many trainings, things like that. But I just always want to put out that disclaimer just so that everyone understands like my lens. And if you ask me a super detailed clinical question, I'll just be like, you're brilliant, that's amazing. I'm gonna go tag resources and get back to you, right? Just wanted to put that out there. Also, I'm super excited that there's so many people from across the, not the country, the state here today. I've just moved to right outside of Smithfield from Richmond. I lived in Richmond for 12 years, which is wild because I still think I'm 16 in my head. And just super stoked to see so many parts of Virginia like represented. So I think that's fun. That's one of the perks of virtual, right? Need to get out more. Alrighty, so let me back up. What is a pronoun? Don't Google it. Don't get on TikTok. Go back to 6th grade English. You can shoot it in the chat if that feels comfier. Anyone remember what a pronoun might be? You could totally Google it. I would never know. Small shortcut for referring to a person. Descriptive. Takes place of a noun, describes a noun. Love it. Cool. Great. So we're all going back to elementary school, right? I think we may have all blocked it out. So a pronoun in its simplest way is a noun that's replacing that main subject, right? So if we have this simple sentence of DeHaven went to the store and they bought milk, they is the pronoun. If you circle it, draw an arrow to DeHaven, it's just replacing my name, right? So some other examples of pronouns: she, her, he, him, they, them. Pronouns, they're one of those things where it's a tool to describe an identity, but is not an identity in and of itself, right? So if someone asks like, hey, please share your pronouns, what are your pronouns? They're just trying to know how to honor you and affirm you in this way. And if the idea of using more gender neutral pronouns feels like mind-blowing, like what is happening right now, remember, language always changes. It's always growing and evolving with communities and cultures. So as our communities evolve and change, so does our language, right? Because we as humans have created language. Mind-blowing. So we can change the rules as needed to fit our needs. And the APA grammar gods, I don't know who these people are, determine that as we can use gender neutral language to describe a singular person and groups as well. And if you think about it, we use gender neutral language all the time. We just may not realize it. For example, moving to the Hampton Roads area, the driving, it's a little intense. Or if you live in Northern Virginia, it's a little frightening. And you might be tootling down 95, someone cuts you off and you yell, they're a horrible driver, right? Or if you're in an office, you pick up a coffee cup, someone left their coffee cup behind. Does anyone know who this is, right? We often do this when we don't know the gender of someone. We're just not really aware of it. It's kind of one of those autopilot things. So it's not as uncommon as folks might think about. So just some things around pronouns, right? In big groups like this, if you do any sort of group work, trainings, things like that, I'm a big fan of asking folks, please share the pronouns that you feel safe and comfortable using in this space. So that way I'm not asking folks to out themselves or feel pressured to out themselves if they're just not comfortable, right? Every space is different. So just do what feels right for you in that moment. And if the idea of asking someone their pronouns gives you deep anxiety, cool. You don't have to do that. You can just maybe display your pronouns in an email signature. If you rock a lanyard, you could have like a little pin, things like that. Those are all cues that you're willing and able to have this conversation without necessarily having that kind of awkward moment of like, hello, friend, I don't know you. Please share me something personal. So kind of the vibe of today, right? We're going to go through some what I call like foundational concepts. This is just so that we all have the same language. And if you feel you are like an expert on all things LGBTQ, congratulations. I'm still learning, I'm still growing. So please let me know how you hit that status. But if you feel really, really comfortable with this, right? Think of a way of how can I learn and grow just a little bit, or take some notes, and then maybe you can lay all of this out for parents or folks who really have never heard of any of these things that we're about to talk about, right? Like figure out a way to help yourself to learn and grow a little bit more. So we're going to rock out these foundational concepts. We're going to go into some risk factors. We're going to have a beautiful, awkward few moments of breakout rooms, right? It's going to be so awkward. It will be beautiful. It will be great. Then we're going to come back and I'm going to try to allow plenty of time for problem solving and things like that, because I'm a firm believer in people getting their questions asked and exploring real life situations than me creating some random list of, hey, here are some action steps you can do, right? It always seems to be the most helpful when people can kind of think through different issues that are coming up. And I will name, I'm not the best at checking the chat for questions, comments. I will do my very best and try to pause along the way. So kind of already touched on this a little bit already, but I really encourage you to know where you are, like not even on like your knowledge or comfortability with knowledge on things LGBTQ, but even more so just like, where are you at as a human? Like today I went through and I paused all social media because I was like, I cannot, right? It's just, it is so much, it is so just absolutely terrifying right now. And I really want y'all to just take care of you. Maybe you had a really stressful morning with family, you got out of bed and that was just the struggle bus of the day and we're just breathing. Beautiful. Take care of yourself, do what you need to do. Take advantage of being virtual and just show up for yourself first above all else. Because if we're not okay, we can't show up for anyone else in our life, right? Alrighty, so this is the magical spectrum of support. Huzzah. So we have hater, tolerant, accepting, and ally, right? Has everyone heard of these terms roughly before? Maybe. Yeah, okay, cool. So in every community, I have tutored all across Virginia, other states, doing this work, and I have seen these 4 boxes represented in every single community. And I think it's always this really interesting dynamic of trying to like figure out how do I balance all of these voices, right? Especially like my background is I've done a lot of work in schools, like providing trainings, offering support to LGBTQ youth in schools. And there's so many different voices of how do I navigate this to serve this youth in front of me. So if you find yourself in that situation, my cop out is, what are my ethics? What are the best practices? What does the research tell me? And the research tells me that supporting and affirming LGBTQ plus youth is literally life-saving and supports their mental well-being. So that's what I'm going to do in my professional lens and try to find ways to counter the hater, the tolerant, and even try to move folks from not even accepting into allyship, right? And I'm curious, like when y'all hear allyship, what comes to mind? Again, feel free to put it in the chat. On their side, support, standing alongside, joining with, support, joining with, yeah, love it, absolutely. So just being in community with folks, right? Like trying to show up, trying to learn, being open to letting people be their full selves, or at least starting that journey, right? So like all of those are absolutely brilliant. And I think right now in our communities, both like locally and across the country, we are seeing a very intense wave of hater, right? A very intense wave of anti-LGBTQ plus legislation. The latest number I saw was about 450 anti-LGBTQ plus bills have been proposed across the country. That is a staggering amount. And some of the policies that are popping up in Florida and Tennessee, other states as well, they are intentionally trying to erase not only the LGBTQ plus community, but specifically the trans non-binary communities, right? And so what can I do to not just stand alongside, but also move into a more active space so that I'm pushing back on that hater tolerant voice, and then trying to help provide education, support, learning and growing to get people from accepting into allyship and even beyond allyship, right? So what I want folks to think about as we go through our chat today is, how do I move past allyship? Allyship is great. It's a beautiful first step, but we're in a moment where we desperately need to move past I stand alongside you, and how do I move into action with you? So just things to ponder. All right, so this is the POWER acronym, right? We have LGBTQ+++. So we have lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, trans, or queer, and or questioning, right? So this is the POWER acronym. The plus is all of the many identities that exist underneath all of these letters. So if you are super anxious about not knowing every single LGBTQ plus identity that exists, you are not alone. You can Google, and there are so many lists from organizations like GLAAD, GLSEN, Trevor Project. Those are super reliable organizations that have hundreds of identities, and it's okay to not know. It is totally fine. I have facilitated many LGBTQ plus groups. Youth have come up to me and shared their identities, let me into their world. And I'm like, friends, love it. Thank you for telling me. I have no clue what that is. I'm gonna totally Google it. If there's anything you'd like to tell me, please let me know, right? Like, regardless of your identity, I see you as a human. Let me know what you need to affirm you, and we can like rock out this bop it and like eat way too much pasta together. It'll be great. So just say you don't know and find a way to educate yourself, right? But again, there's so many resources on those identities. Just to break up this acronym a little bit more, lesbian, gay, bisexual, that's touching on sexuality, right? Who am I attracted to? Who do I want to date, hold hands with? The bodies, the folks, the identities that I'm like, hey, you're a cutie, I see you, right? Queer is a really fascinating word that has a really complicated, interesting history. Totally encourage you to nerd out and Google that. Queer I've seen used as a shorthand for the LGBTQ plus community. It can also be used to be a sexual identity, gender identity. I've seen it used as a political identity. It's a very like chameleon-like word. If that kind of is breaking your brain and you're like, I don't know what that means, cool, embrace the chaos, embrace the rainbow. It's a word that is very personal and has different meanings for different people. So I'm all about letting people use the words that describe them and not trying to police or say, that's right, that's wrong. Just let people be. If you like the word queer, love it, cool. It's also important to be mindful of generation and evolving language. For example, if I'm in a space with older folks who have lived through the 60s, 70s, 80s, I'm not going to go up and be like, hello, my fellow queers, like, let's chat about the queer community, right? Like, because that can be really triggering, because the history of queer is that it was hate speech and used to dehumanize folks, right? Now, if I'm in a space with middle schoolers and I'm like, what's up? Like, let's talk about queer stuff. They're like, okay, cool. Like, there's less charge because the meaning and the connection to the word has changed over time, right? So always important to just be aware of the groups that we're chatting with. Do not go up to someone and ask, are you queer? Like, I don't know you like that. It reads wrong, right? Like, let's just not do it. you can say, I would like to talk about the LGBTQ plus community, the queer community, but don't ask someone directly. It just never, I have yet to see that one go well. And then lastly, we have T for transgender. That is touching on my gender identity. So to keep on swimming, these are the lovely foundational concepts. So each one of these triangles is its separate triangle, but they're overlapping. They're in conversation with one another. What we are often taught is that all of these triangles are one kind of messy blob, when in fact they are separate entities that need their own breath and need to be like respected and seen. So starting on this journey, right? We are all born, we pop out and exist in a little body, right? If you know another way to enter this world, please let me know. Super fascinated by that one. So when we are born, right, often what happens? Like, think about it. If you've seen like Grey's Anatomy ever, a baby pops out and it's announced it's a, don't overthink it, boy, girl, love it. Beautiful. Yes. So what we're doing, right, is we're looking at bodies and we're putting them into categories. Our brains as humans, we really enjoy categories. We like neat little boxes with a clear criteria. I know how to place you, right? Our human bodies are very, very complex entities. They're made up of a wide variety of things that I will truly never understand. I flunked out of VCU chemistry beautifully. It was great, right? Super complex. So we have these two categories to try to capture the billions of bodies that exist on this planet, right? And the uncomfortable reality is that human bodies are on a spectrum because we're a part of nature, right? And if you look at nature, nature is super weird. For example, the mighty seahorse. Male seahorses give birth to baby seahorses. Please YouTube this if you've never seen it. Literally, the babies shoot out of the male seahorse's belly. It makes no sense. Absolutely adorable. Frogs are changing their sex based on their ecosystems, temperatures. It's very, very weird. As disconnected as we might feel from nature, as we sit looking at screens, as y'all listen to me chat, Lord bless you, we are still connected to nature, right? Which means sometimes our bodies don't fit neatly into these two categories. So for that massive community, the term is intersex, and that's just anyone whose body is not neatly fitting into the categories of male or female. Intersex is incredibly, incredibly broad. The science is incredibly complex. Sometimes medical intervention is needed. A lot of times though, it just isn't. Medical intervention has been encouraged to pause just to allow folks to grow up and identify and see like, hey, how do I feel in my body? What do I need? If medical intervention is needed, that's a different conversation. But we're not going to surgically change a person's body just because I don't know where to put you into these two categories. So if you've never heard of intersex and you might think it's like an incredibly rare phenomenon, the rough rule of thumb is that there are as many folks with natural red hair as there are folks who are intersex. Do not go up to someone with red hair and ask if they're intersex. It is none of your business. And not all folks who, just because you have red hair, that does not equal intersex. Stats don't work that way. So just want to make that very, very clear. The point to all of this, though, is that we have our physical bodies, we're immediately put into categories. And from that category, we are expected to turn into young boys, young women. That's the truth for some, it's not for all. So this is just our physical shells. So then we go into gender identity. Gender identity is my internal understanding. It's how I feel in my heart, mind, and soul. In my brain, I am a 16-year-old skater boy. I'm just like a punky little dude listening to Green Day, but I, alas, cannot skateboard, and I'm 31. So we're just having a constant state of crises as a solid millennial. So with gender identity, this again is, there are these two main categories of man, woman, girl, boy. Some folks fit into those two categories, a lot of folks do not. The language around gender is what we call socially constructed, which means it's going to vary depending on my culture, on my community. It's going to change across time and space. There's a lot of really fascinating history showing how there have been different languages for gender across the globe, across time and space. And I really, really encourage folks to dive into that history. There's a really fascinating book called A Transgender History by Dr. Susan Stryker, I believe is her name. And just a really cool book that goes into a more like global history of specifically the trans community. So these concepts have always existed. They've just always been in a state of changing and growing as communities and culture change. And just to be clear, we all have a gender identity, right? Even if you identify as someone who is agender, we still are in relationship to this, right? So with some more specific gender identities, cisgender, right, is a term used to describe someone whose sex assigned at birth and gender identity align. So for example, when you popped out into this world, you were assigned male at birth. As you grew up, you identify as a boy, as a man. So that means you're cisgender. I learned from a very smart Latin teacher that cis is on the same side of the more you know, right? So you can drop that at your next cocktail party and be like, huzzah, here's your nugget of knowledge, right? Transgender is a very massive umbrella term for anyone whose sex assigned at birth and gender identity do not align. So typically, historically and presently, we very much are focused on this kind of experience of I'm going to go from male to woman, from female to man, right? And I want to make it very, very clear that there's no criteria to be trans. If you say you identify as trans, then that is it. And I think that's really, really important, especially when you're working with trans youth, if they feel like, oh, I have to seek medical gender affirmation, I have to get on hormones, I have to do these things. It's like there's no haves or shoulds, right? It's what feels right as you're ready, what you can access. Like, let's just take it one step at a time, and you are you. There's no checking of the boxes, right? I think that's really, really important when working with trans and just LGBTQ plus in general, right? So just some things around language, right? When we are talking about trans folks, we want to use that person first language, and we want to avoid things like transgenderism, transgendered, transgendering. Like, it's not a verb. We're just I'm centering the person, the human. Also, just think about, is it even relevant for me to talk about their trans identity? Things to think about, right? Like, if I'm working with a youth, is it relevant for me to mention their identity? Or can I just say, hey, I'm working with a client, he's rocking and rolling, we had a great session, right? You wouldn't talk about clients. But like, if I'm talking about a family member, like, I'm not going to center their trans identity always. Think about, when is it necessary? When is it relevant? Or am I just feeling like kind of this tick to like overshare, and just ponder that why. So some awesome examples of the trans community. We have MJ Rodriguez, Laverne Cox, Elliot Page. So MJ Rodriguez, Laverne Cox, both use she, her pronouns, identify as trans women or just women, right? Because again, if I had the pleasure to just hang out with MJ Rodriguez and we were at a restaurant, I wouldn't announce to my group, hello, this is MJ Rodriguez, a trans woman, right? Like, that is absolutely bizarre. It makes no sense. I'm doing it in this moment because we're talking about representation. So that's the why. Some things around, especially with MJ Rodriguez, she was in, the biggest thing I know her of in is Pose. And Pose is a really awesome show for representation, education, showing history and the power of the trans community in New York in like the 80s, 90s. But just for your knowledge and continual growth, highly recommend Pose as like a binge show for this weekend, because I think it's going to be cold, so we should all just hide in blankets. Elliot Page, everyone know Elliot Page? Do folks know these people overall? Yeah. So Elliot Page's first big movie was Juno. That came out when I was in high school. Like, when I saw it, my mind was blown, because I was like, this level of sarcasm is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen in my life. So when Juno came out, this was way before Elliot was open about his trans identity. And so at the time of Juno, he was still going by his birth name or his dead name, which is Ellen. So now I think the latest thing Elliot has been in is Umbrella Academy, which is on Netflix, another really fun show. And often what I'll hear is folks will be like, Ellen started her career in Juno and now Elliot is in Umbrella Academy. But what we want to do is we want to honor the person's name that they're telling us to use in real time. So instead I would say Elliot started his career in Juno and now is rocking out Umbrella Academy, right? And I see this a lot when people are talking about youth in their life, trans youth in their life, is they'll say the youth's birth name or dead name, and then talk about they came out as trans and then transition to their chosen name. But I just want the youth's chosen name throughout their whole life. I never need to know that youth's birth name, dead name, legal name, even if it is a legal name, right? Have that documented somewhere, but I'm gonna honor that youth's chosen name. And I know that can get tricky, especially if you're working with the youth and guardians are not on board, the youth isn't out, all of that can get very, very tricky. Finding ways to affirm that youth is really, really crucial. So even if that is just when you are one-on-one with that kiddo and you have that transparent conversation of, hey, I'm gonna try to not use your birth name when you're around your parents or your guardians. I'm gonna say the youth or your kiddo, things like that. If I have to use your dead name, I will. Please know, I see you, I'm just trying to protect you. So although that can feel weird, again, it's what's keeping that person safe and just being as transparent as possible and then figuring out ways to affirm when we can. Is all that making sense? I know I'm talking about a lot of things very, very quickly, so I'm trying to pause. So Janelle Monáe, love Janelle Monáe. Janelle came out, I feel like fairly recently, as non-binary, gender expansive, overall uses they, them pronouns. So I found this quote from an interview that Janelle did. I forget where the article was, but the quote is, I just don't see myself as a woman solely. I feel all my energy. I feel like God is so much bigger than the he or the she. And if I am from God, I am everything. And I love this quote because I feel like often, especially in the United States, like 2023, we view gender as this very fixed thing, right? Because we're taught that your body equals your gender identity when it does not, right? Gender is this very expansive, ever-changing thing. And I love that this quote from Janelle is kind of touching on this energy, this vibe, this expansiveness that, especially if you dive into the history and the cultures of indigenous communities, you start seeing that, but not so much in like US or Western cultures. So I'm just trying to offer those nuggets of just trying to think of gender in a very, very different way than the fixed stationary way that we're taught. And also to identify that if you have a client or someone in your life who is having a really intense reaction and is like, no, this is not okay, there are two genders, like you're making this up. A lot of times from my experience, that's coming out of fear. That's coming out of, I don't understand what this is, and this is scary and big. That doesn't excuse someone being a bully or being really mean and like causing harm, right? Like we need to navigate our fear and our big emotions like in a calm, like grounded way. But it is to say that I can see where you're at. So from my experience, offering that grace and education if they're willing to listen, for what it's worth. So non-binary, this is a identity underneath the trans umbrella, right? So if I have like the massive umbrella that is trans, non-binary is often seen as an identity subgroup that is underneath that. So this is anyone who feels like they do not fit into those two categories of man or woman, maybe feel like they're sort of floating in between, maybe a combination of man, woman, or just the freedom to explore. So speaking for me, myself, and I love the language around non-binary and using they, them pronouns, because I feel like it gives me the ability to create my own gender experience, right? So I can, you know, try to be a super suave gentleman type dude, I don't even know what that means, for my partner. And then all of a sudden I can be like, hey, love, can we just hide in blankets, giggle, eat ice cream, and watch Grey's Anatomy? Right? Like, I feel like it gives me the ability to just bounce and switch and show up as my full authentic self, rather than feeling like I have to follow this very set script of what it means to be a man or a woman. I like the combination, and it just feels much more at home. So if everyone in this room started calling me by my birth name and saying she, her, like, y'all would get a very different version of me very, very quickly, because that's not me. If y'all started calling me that, you're kind of, I feel like, would be forcing me into this box of a weird warped version of like just not what is in my heart. And so when people are like, hey, DeHaven, they, them, they're super spazzy, they talk way too much, love it, cool. Like, now you're gonna get my full self and I'm gonna show up. And so even if you have someone in your life who uses, who identifies as trans, non-binary, uses different pronouns or a combination of pronouns, and you just do not get it, cool, we don't have to get everything, but I can still honor you and see you as a human being. And I can do my best to respect and affirm you. I'm sure if I had the privilege to get to know all of y'all in this space, there are pieces of your identities and stories that I wouldn't fully understand, but I can empathize and I can learn, and I can treat you with a baseline of decency and humanity. And I think that is unfortunately seriously lacking in our culture right now. And I don't mean that to be like all kumbaya and soapboxy, but it's just like, bro, like, we can be different and still have that baseline respect. So moving on to gender expression. So we have our physical body, we have how we feel in our heart, minds, and soul, our gender identity, how we see ourselves, and then we need to dress our bodies because we cannot run around in our birthday suits. That would be scandalous. So with gender expression, this is everything from hair, makeup, shoes, clothing, mannerisms, interests, everything in our culture is gendered. It is absolutely fascinating. My favorite thing is going to like a Target or Walmart in the toy section, and it's like one aisle is like black and gray and like Batman, and then the other aisle is like pink and purple. And I'm like, okay, these are your options, go. And then I feel like I love Target because they're trying to do this like retro toy thing where it's like all wood, and it's like take the stick and the wheel down the street, right? So with gender expression, this is something that changes again across time, across space, across communities. For example, George Washington, right? During George Washington's time, we were rocking in some wigs, we had our high heels, we had our tights, right? For the most part, you don't see that in today's culture. You don't see a lot of cisgender guys going down the streets in high heels, tights. Like, usually I feel like if you see that, you kind of get like a pause and like, wait, what's happening, right? But during George Washington's time, this was like the standard thing. George Washington wore high heels and tights, right? And to my knowledge, identified as a cisgender man. So gender expression does not equal my gender identity. Just because I am a man wearing a dress, I can still be a man. I can explore and express my gender in a wide variety of different ways while my gender identity is staying constant. So you might have youth in your life who say, I am a girl, and she, like, that young girl only dresses in pants and shorts. You will never see her in a dress or a skirt because it doesn't feel comfortable. It doesn't feel authentic for her, but her gender identity is staying consistent. Or you might have youth who identify as trans guys and love wearing dresses still, love playing with makeup. If you say you're a guy, you're a guy. There's so many different ways to express yourselves, right? So what we want to do with this is try to create this pause, this automatic processing that our brains go into, where I see you have long hair and you're wearing a dress, you must be a woman, I'm going to use she, her pronouns and say, yes, ma'am. Just pause. I can still respect you through eye contact, through body language, through the tone of my voice without ever using gendered language. And I say that as someone who grew up in Mississippi, where I got detention if I did not say yes, sir, no, ma'am, right? But there's so many different ways to show that respect. Once I know how you identify, lovely, like we can dude it up, ma'am it up, all of that great stuff. And that can maybe even be a way to affirm you as a human. But I'm just going to try to pause. Some things around gender expression. For trans women, cisgender men who express themselves in a more feminine way, the rates of discrimination and harassment are significantly higher, right? So for myself, identify as non-binary, and I present in a more masculine way. And I'm also white, able-bodied, middle upper class. All of these things are protective factors that help me experience life in a safer way, versus I have very dear friends who are trans women, who are cisgender men and present in very feminine ways, and their rates of harassment are much, much higher, and their daily interactions can be often much more intense. So for the LGBTQ community, there are different experiences within it and different interactions with power, privilege, and all of those are also very, very important to take in mind. So lastly, we have sexual and romantic orientation. Yes, these are two different things, contrary to what we are often taught. So for example, I can maybe want to hold hands with someone, make out with someone, whatever your vibe is, but not want to look longingly into your eyes over a candlelit dinner and share all of our emotions. That's my happy place. It's not everyone else's, right? We all have different thresholds. Or maybe I want just that candlelit dinner, and I just really am not interested in you touching me, doing anything like that. Or maybe I really need to get to know you in a deep, intellectual, spiritual, emotional way before I can even think about like kissing your cheek. There are a wide variety of spectrums when it comes to sexual and romantic attraction. So some terms that are really coming up, or identities, I mean, that are really coming up are asexual and aromantic. And those are just folks who experience sexual and or romantic attraction at a different level. Like some folks really do not have experience either sexual or romantic attraction. Other folks, it's just a spectrum. And it's like, sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. I'm just living my life, right? This is, both of these terms are coming up more and more, especially with younger youth. And so again, it's helping them understand like you're not broken, it's not a phase, it's how you relate to people, and that's totally fine. You can still have loving, meaningful relationships, they just might look differently, but just not trying to immediately pop into this language of, oh, you just need to meet the right person or anything like that. Okay, so with our identities, right? Again, we often get forced, I feel like, into one box, one category, right? When in fact, we have so many pieces that make up who we are. Like even at the start of this, like in the chat, right? Like there were different professions, names, pronouns, interests, where we live, oh, wow, good Lord. Brain's going too fast, where we live on the planet, in the state. Like all of these things come together to impact who we are and how we show up in the world, right? So you may have heard the term intersectionality. This is an academic term that's coming from the lived experience of specifically Black cisgender women from Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, and has kind of been evolved to speak to all of the different pieces that make up who we are. So when we have LGBTQ come and work with us and try to seek support, they're bringing in all of these different pieces. So yes, they may be coming to you because they're experiencing struggles, right? They're experiencing anxiety, depression, PTSD, a wide variety of things. That doesn't automatically mean it's because of their LGBTQ plus identity. It could be because they are struggling to find food. Their parents are fighting all the time, but they're getting a lot of support for their LGBTQ plus identity. That doesn't necessarily mean that's the source of the stress, right? So just trying to be mindful of seeing this whole youth and not just one piece of their story. I always like to think of youth coming in with their solar systems, right? Like they have all of these different community pieces that they come with. So we have dominantly home, school, and community. When you think back to your time in middle school or high school, how many hours did you spend in school? I feel like I spent 7 in the morning to like 7 at night, right? Like I feel like I lived at school and then I went home and that was my entire life. So I always think of things in like this balance system. If school and home are bad, what is the point, right? Like, why am I going to show up the next day if I'm getting bullied and picked on all day long at school? I get home and that's really stressful and not fun. Like, what am I doing, right? Versus if I can at least find a breath of fresh air in my greater community, like maybe an outside organization, or I can find some friends that I can connect with, an online support group, like through the Trevor Project, like different things like that, to just try to catch my breath and be my full self. Because youth need at least one space to just be them, right? To be a weird 16, 12-year-old kid. And like, I don't even know, what do they do, right? What did we do when we were 12? Do y'all even remember? No, blocked it out, that's fair. So we're about to get into some pretty heavy stats on LGBTQ plus youth. What I think is really, really important is that LGBTQ plus youth do not have higher rates of mental health crises because of their identities. It's because of how I'm treated once I come out, or even before I come out, right? Like maybe I know I'm gay, but I haven't disclosed it because it's not safe in my greater community. But when youth have support, whether that's home, school, or their larger communities, they're rocking and rolling for the most part, right? When these supports are present, they can thrive. When not, they are at risk. But it's not because you are bisexual, therefore you are broken, right? Like that is not what's happening here. So some of the main risk factors that we're going to focus on today are stigma, family rejection, and hostile school environments. So with stigma, I used to have this as isolation, but to me, isolation is kind of the symptom of a greater issue. And so with stigma, that is my internal and external treatment of, or stereotyping, labeling of the groups that I'm a part of, right? And what I mean by specifically internal stigma is, I remember like when I was around 16, I was dating my first girlfriend, right? I was convinced we were having this like secret relationship that no one knew about. That likely was not the case. But I was trying to self-accept my sexual identity. I knew I was probably gay, and I was like, okay, cool. We're going to sit and we're going to process this. Didn't come out for years later, but that was like my journey. But I remember like vividly standing in this person's kitchen thinking, okay, I can be gay, but I cannot be trans. Like that is something that we cannot do. That is not even in the realm of possibilities. And it wasn't until I met my now wife at 26 that I was even able to open the door to begin the self-acceptance of, okay, I'm trans, I'm non-binary. Because my brain had so much stigma, hatred, prejudice of what it meant to be trans because of the conditioning that I was taught. I was taught that to be trans is to be less than, to be broken, to be a freak. And I was like, I can't do that. It's too big, it's too scary. I don't know how to navigate it. So I had to do all of that internal work to figure out these massive feelings. So for youth that are experiencing that, or just hearing all of the visceral hatred that comes up from being who they are, that results in higher rates of depression, anxiety, isolation, substance use, suicide, ideation, attempts, all of these different things. It's just general mental health distress, right? And again, if I'm getting stigma and prejudice in my school community, at home, at school, like that is so many voices of saying I am less than and I'm not worthy. And that conditioning, I know adults that are still navigating this, right? Let alone at 10, 11, 12 years old, when like you should just be trying to figure out like, what do I want for breakfast, right? Like that should be like, we should just be able to be a kid and be a weirdo and not be trying to figure out these massive, super complex feelings and and systems that are coming at you. So with family rejection, this can vary widely on, I love you, I accept you, let's go to Pride, and I'm going to be an incredible advocate, to get out of my house, you are no longer welcome, right? It's like everything in between, and absolutely can be a fluid journey. There's a group I work really closely with called He, She, Z, and We, and it's spelled Z-E. It's a parent family education support group for families that have trans and non-binary youth in them. So what they do is they provide a space for parents, guardians to navigate all of their complex feelings without the youth being present. Totally free. They meet virtually. Cannot speak highly enough about them. I've seen parents go into, start out with he, she, Z, and we, who are super like not accepting of their LGBTQ plus kiddo or their trans kiddo. And then by the end of it, they're those parents who are giving out free hugs at Pride, right? It's just getting that education. It's getting that time to process your experiences, and just understanding that your kid is still your kid, right? Like your child hasn't suddenly changed or evaporated. There's still that whole dynamic weirdo that you've grown up with, that you've raised. This is just a piece of them, and you have been given the privilege to get to know their full self, right? So highly, highly recommend He, She, Z, and We. With family acceptance, this is the #1 protective factor in everything I've ever read. If we can't get family on board, the struggle is real, right? Like trying to figure out ways to get parents on board is absolutely massive. And again, I'm a firm believer in education, in time, and just having those real conversations. Again, we just want to do it away from the youth. So lastly, hostile school environments. I feel like it's not surprising that schools are not in a great place right now, and they haven't been for a while. Youth that are bullied show higher rates of suicide compared to others who aren't. The vast majority of LGBTQ plus surveyed through the Trevor Project, through organizations like GLSEN, are saying that schools have been incredibly hostile spaces for a number of years now, right? And I think often folks think that's peer-to-peer, but often it's the school policies that are being handed down. It's the teachers and school staff that are encouraging the stigma and the prejudice and the bullying of LGBTQ plus youth. And it's just this general environment of folks not knowing how to step in and speak up to change the culture of schools to just be safer spaces for everyone, right? Like, for example, 80% of trans youth avoided using the restroom in schools. That is like mind-blowing to me. And also, if you think about like a time that you've ever gone on a road trip, right? You're just cruising, all of a sudden you register, hey, I really need to use the bathroom, and you can't. And that sensation of like white knuckling the steering wheel, like holding your breath, just being like, you're not even thinking, you're like in primal brain mode. Like imagine being in that space all day, every day, and you're trying to learn algebra or English or whatever, right? Like you're not there, you're not present. And what we see is that with hostile schools, we have lower grades, higher anxiety, and youth not going on to seek secondary education. And I should also mention that when we insert the intersecting identities around race, around class, right, all of these stats get even worse, right? So for Black trans youth, the rates of anxiety and depression are significantly higher. School experiences are often worse. Like, again, we always want to take into those various factors of who are the most vulnerable and who's not getting access to the information and the support that they need. So I'm going to keep on swimming because I'm trying to be mindful of time. But one thing I just want to have folks be aware of is like the barriers to seeking mental health, right? And some of the barriers identified by the Trevor Project and a most recent survey was fear of discussing mental health concerns, scared to obtain parent guardian permission, fear of not being taken seriously, and lack of affordability. Are any of those barriers like surprising to folks? Not really, no. So I always think of like, what are ways that I can interrupt those barriers? Right? Whether that's maybe not like more formal mental health, but are there different ways that I can engage in my community to start conversations, to develop positive representation, to go into schools and help train school staff to affirm LGBTQ plus youth in their schools? Like just different ways that you can interrupt that permission barrier, the affordability, the not being taken seriously, like all of those different things. And again, what are the communities that are the most at risk? So BIPOC LGBTQ plus youth, we're less likely to gain access. Again, the stigma of being LGBTQ plus and the stigma of my community, my culture doesn't talk about mental health. Like, I don't want to be seen as weak because I'm feeling sad. Like I should just suck it up and do better, right? So how do I get access to those most vulnerable youth to offer support? Things to think about. Okay, so with protective factors, right? When youth have protective factors, the rates of suicide, ideation, and attempts go down. I think sometimes suicide prevention affirmation can feel really big. I love this slide because it is so simple that when youth are affirmed in a consistent way with their name, their rates of depression, suicide ideation, and attempts decrease significantly, right? That is me saying, hey, DeHaven, what's up? In a consistent, ongoing way. That's not me going through a training. That's not me having to change policies. That is me one-on-one in a hallway, wherever, just saying, hey, I see you, how's it going? Because a name is more than a name, right? This is how I see myself and what I need to be my full self. So right out of the gate, that is something everyone in this space can commit to. And if you misgender a youth, if you use the wrong pronouns, you apologize, you correct, and you find your inner Dory and you keep on swimming. We don't want to fall to our hands and knees and beg for forgiveness because it's not about us, right? We're the ones who made the misstep, who caused that moment of harm. So I'm going to take that ownership, apologize, learn, and do better for next time. And so it's just like constantly navigating that. So when we are thinking about how to be an advocate, accomplice, a co-conspirator for or with LGBTQ plus youth, right? It's always figuring out how to listen, engage, learn, and continue the conversation, and figure out how do I show up in spaces without taking over spaces, right? So for example, there's, as I mentioned, there's a lot of anti-LGBTQ legislation happening. It is really impactful and powerful that if a cisgender person goes into those spaces and testifies at a school board meeting, at a state legislature, and says, hey, I'm cisgender, I have no LGBTQ plus family members, loved ones that I know of, but I stand with LGBTQ plus youth, and I firmly believe that we should protect these kiddos. Like that's way more powerful than if I, as a trans person, go into an office and say, you should support trans people. Because often then I'm looked at like, well, of course, that's your agenda, right? So just figuring out those small ways to stand beside and speak up for folks. Or if you're at work and someone says something problematic, pushing back and speaking up and stepping in and saying, hey, like, we're not going to use that language. We're going to honor folks. All of those little things, it might feel small, but it adds up and it creates a ripple effect to interrupting that hate or intolerant. Because from my experience, a lot of times folks who are sort of floating in the middle don't step up or speak in because there's anxiety and we're unsure and I don't know what to do and I'm scared. But through our fear and anxiety, we're allowing some harm to happen, right? And even harm feels like a very light word, because I know trans youth who have received death threats in their community because they're publicly out and are trying to make safer spaces in their community. So that's adults threatening harm in the life of a child. I have very little tolerance for that, right? Like at some point, as a human, I have to step up and speak in and interrupt the hate and the violence that is occurring because this child is at risk, right? Because the rates show that when ongoing toxic communities and harm is happening, I'm putting that youth at risk for mental health crises. So there's different ways to engage with this, whether that's at the personal level, community, state level, but highly encourage y'all to continue to explore that with one another. And in all of the resources that are in the Dropbox, there should be, especially with the training scenario, there's a large list of different research articles, handouts that hopefully will be helpful for y'all. And I'm always here as well. And everyone will be getting these slide decks as well. These are some other specific areas of support and the impact of that support, just to help break it down a little bit more and just try to get your wheels thinking of, oh, I can show up in this small way as well. Yeah, so I want to be mindful of time. I think there are a few announcements that needed to be made. I'm going to stick around if